Thank you for joining us for today's February webinar of the National Center for Rural Roads. Today's webinar is entitled Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide. It looks like today we have quite a few of you joining us. Most of you are joining us from the Midwest or the West, but we do also have some representation from the Northeast and Southeast. Most of you are joining us in a group with only one person, but I do see a few groups of multiple people, in which case, as always with our webinars, if you wouldn't mind sending us an email to info, I-N-F-O, at ruralsafetycenter.org and provide us with the names and email addresses for those of you who are in that room. This will allow us to send you the survey following today's webinar. By completing this survey is the only way that you can obtain certificates of completion and CEUs for today's training. So again, if you are in a group with multiple people, please send names and email addresses to info, I-N-F-O, at ruralsafetycenter.org. Looks like most of you are joining us from the computer only. If you do have any issues with the sound, I would ask you to please call in. You can find the dial-in audio number in the top left-hand corner of your screen. We do have every once in a while, sometimes the internet connection will cause audio problems and you'll hear better on the phone, so just in case you do have any issues with that. It does also look like we have a good majority of you from local transportation departments and some other federal, state, local agencies today, but again, we do have quite a few from all different backgrounds, education, private consultants, public land agencies, so thank you all for joining us today. I am going to move you over to our presentation now. So a few webinar logistics for all of you. This presentation will be about an hour and a half long. It is recorded and will be archived on our website in case you'd like to share this with anyone in the future. For quality of this recording, we do mute everyone's phones during the presentation. But if you're listening on the phone, please also mute your computer. We did notice that a few of you were doing both the phone and the computer. If you have both of the lines open, it will cause some feedback for you. To maximize today's presentation, up in the top right-hand corner, you'll find 4 arrows. If you click on that, it will make the presentation itself full screen for you. At the end of each section that we have today with our speakers, there will be time for question and answers. As I mentioned before, everyone's phones are on mute, so the way that we would ask you to go about putting in questions is to use the chat pod, which is over on the left-hand side of your screen. You can type in those questions at any time whenever you think of them, and when we do stop for a question and answer section, we will go back to your questions. So again, feel free to put those in at any time. There is also a handout pod at the bottom of your screen. It's in the left-hand corner now. That contains a copy of today's presentation in case you'd like to download that. It will also be available on our website with this recorded audio as well. And then the last thing is to make sure that you fill out our follow-up surveys, if you wouldn't mind doing that. There will be 2 of them. One will come today following the webinar. That one will allow you to select if you would like a completion certificate or CEUs for this webinar. It generally takes about 2 to 3 weeks to get those completion certificates out to you. The CEUs, you will be provided with a form, and you will need to fill that out and send it back to a different department at Montana State University, who will then assign those to you. The second survey will come to you in about 3 months. That survey is to try and help us determine whether or not you've shared any of the information that you learned today, or whether you go and look at the handbook that's going to be discussed and use it at all. Today we're lucky enough to have 2 presenters joining us from Alta Planning and Design. We're very happy to have them with us today. We have Tim Gustafson. Tim is a certified planner and is a senior associate and office manager for Alta Planning and Design in their Chicago office. With more than a decade of experience in the field of transportation, he has focused his career on the planning, design, education, and training in the best practices for active transportation. In the Chicago metropolitan region, Tim has worked on projects for various municipalities and agencies, including the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, the Regional Transportation Authority, and the State Departments of Transportation for Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Vermont. We also have Nick Falbo joining us today. Nick is an associate with Alta Planning and Design in the Portland office and specializes in active transportation planning and design. Nick was the lead associate at Alta responsible for development of the STAR Guide. In addition to his work in development of best practices for planning and design, Nick is a certified trainer for the National Association of City Transportation Officials. So we're very happy again to have them with us today. And they will be talking with you about the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide that they put together. So once you've completed today's webinar, you will have an overview of the STAR Guide, which was published in January of 2017 by FHWA. At the end of today's presentation, we will be providing you for a link as to where you can find that guide. To achieve that goal, today what we're hoping that you will learn is to describe the national level history of design flexibility and understand how this new resource relates to existing standards, to understand the range of mixed traffic and shared roadway facilities included in the guide, to understand the range of visually and physically separated facilities in the guide, and to identify other opportunities for completing links in rural multimodal networks and learn where to access this guide. And so now I will turn it over to Nick, and he'll get you guys started. Nick?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to share about this new resource that we've created to support the creation of multimodal transportation systems in small town and rural communities. So I'm going to start out and kind of just open up the context for where this guide fits into those existing resources that you may already know about, and just sort of understand how it works with things like the MUTCD and the Green Book. There's been a lot of change happening over the last decade or so with regards to design flexibility and the creation of streets that are more complete, that serve modes such as walking and biking and can be more transit supportive. And there's kind of a history there that I think is worth knowing so that you can understand kind of where this fits in. And it starts in around 2010. In 2010, FHWA released a policy statement expressing support for good design for walking and biking. And in this statement, they actually say here they want DOT encourages transportation agencies to go beyond the minimum requirements and to provide good facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians of all ages and abilities. And as far as I can tell, this is one of the first times that last sentence, all ages and abilities, has been sort of officially endorsed, that to create a facility that you could imagine maybe young children even using independently, or the elderly using independently. And so after this statement, the profession really stood up and started to live up to this expectation. And they released some design guidelines to help achieve this vision. In 2010, ITE, the Institute for Transportation Engineers, released a guide called Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares. This report really focused on the main streets of our cities and our towns. And it really promoted good pedestrian-oriented and bicycle-oriented design. Shortly after that, in 2011, and updated again in 2012, was the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide, which really brought together the latest thinking in terms of bikeway design for our cities, sort of the leading bike cities in the U.S., really sharing knowledge amongst each other and with the rest of the country. A year later, in 2013, NACTO released their Urban Street Design Guide. This was more of a pedestrian-focused design guide that wasn't quite as focused on bicycles, but more about just creating full, complete streets. And these guides came out, and there was some resistance. There was some questions from jurisdictions, from agencies about, how do I use this guide? How does it fit in? Can I even use this guide? And FHWA wanted to be clear, and so they came out with another policy statement, this memo, on design flexibility in 2013 that said, yes, please, we want you to use all of these great resources that have been released by NACTO and ITE so that you can create better streets for everyone. It specifically calls out the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide, the NACTO Streets Design Guide, and the ITE Walkable Urban Thoroughfares Guide. And it mentions that they want designers to use these resources to create multimodal streets. But one thing you might notice is that all of these resources have a very specific urban focus to them. You can see that in the title of these guides, and the memo itself even mentions the application of flexibility in urban areas. And so it's pretty easy to kind of imagine that this push for design flexibility doesn't extend into the small town or rural environment. And, but it certainly does. But what was missing was the guidance to take us there. And so that's where this guide comes in. The Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks document. This was actually, it was released, I think, like the last day of December in 2016. So it came out in 2016. It was announced that in sort of next week at TRB in January 2017. And we are really excited to be able to share this with you today. So this is really the multimodal design guides for the rest of us. Just so you can kind of understand the spectrum of guidance, where this fits in with those other guidelines and the other overarching documents that you may normally refer to. Guidance exists on a spectrum. There's a spectrum of federal to local guidelines, so something like the MUTCD, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, that is a sort of a federal level standard for traffic control and design. And as you sort of move to the local spectrum, you end up with state-specific design guides or maybe even city-specific design guidelines for street design. The national level, federal level guidelines such as the MUTCD, that really gives us guidance on the meanings of different traffic control devices. Colors, striping, markings. It doesn't get into the specifics of maybe how you apply those. And so with MUTCD, you understand the striping. With the guidelines, such as the AASHTO Bike Guide, it talks about how wide that bike lane should be. It talks about how to combine different striping and marking patterns together to create facilities. And so our guide, the STAR Guide, the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide, fits in with this type of guidelines that applies the patterns, the striping, the markings that are in the MUTCD in a certain way for a certain effect. And it's a part of this overall, this process that our field kind of grows and expands. The elements in the STAR Guide are all, they all come out of the MUTCD. Except with one exception, they are all sort of fully compliant with the guidelines that are in the MUTCD. And it's a part of this process where FHWA helps facilitate innovation through promoting good design, promoting experimentation through the request to experiment process, and ultimately transitioning into interim approvals and inclusion into the next MUTCD edition. You can already see that with some past guidelines. For example, in the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide, there was guidance on bike boxes and bicycle signals. At the time, both of those were experimental features, but since then, through the experimentation process, those have become sort of approved through the interim approval process, and they will be included in the next edition of the MUTCD. So this is one piece of a long tradition for creating new good designs on our streets. The STAR Guide is really based on existing guidance. There's nothing in the guide that doesn't exist on the roads in the U.S. today. Most of the material, it's heavily referenced, so while you're going through the guidelines, you can understand where that guidance came from, where those recommendations, what those recommendations are based on. The project itself was funded by a combination of grant money from the Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota, as well as from the Federal Highway Administration itself. This was released and published by Federal Highway Administration. They were heavily involved in the sort of final review and approval of the document. The report itself was prepared by a team here. Alta Planning and Design is sort of the lead author of the guide. We worked with the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University to assess the sort of state of the research and the literature, and to help us just make sure that our guidance reflected the best practice in that area. We also worked with the National Association of Counties, NACO, and they helped us create some focus groups to test the guidelines, to test the guidance, and make sure that it resonated with the population of jurisdiction and agencies that worked in these rural counties. The guide itself ranges from design to planning. There are there's an introduction in the guide that focuses on sort of the needs, the unique needs and context of rural communities. The next 3 chapters focus on facilities. We'll talk a lot about those in detail during today's presentation. At the tail end of the guide, there's a focus on sort of key network opportunities, unique opportunities to design your networks to better support small town and rural communities. And then we focus on planning and project development, sort of the opportunities for funding and working with other federal agencies. All of the guidance itself is presented in an attractive, easy-to-read format. We focus on giving really a broad understanding to the reader as to what this facility type is, what are the benefits that it brings to your communities, where do you use it, where is it most useful to apply on your streets, and all of the guidance is split among geometric design, sort of what are the core dimensions that you're working with, what are the markings and the signs that are all MUTCD compliant that you would use to construct the facility, if there are any special considerations at intersections, and then some notes about implementation and accessibility, because this is really important to create accessible pedestrian facilities. The guide itself is split among 3 different sort of classes of facilities. There's mixed traffic facilities. These are facilities where bicyclists and sometimes pedestrians operate in the roadway with motor vehicle operators. There's visually separated facilities. This is something like a shoulder or a bike lane where we're using markings to separate different lanes for different users. And then there's physically separated facilities, and these are facilities where there's some sort of vertical element or sort of unpaved physical separation between the people walking and biking and the roadway. And these facility types tend to differ based on the context in terms of speed and volume of the roadway. As the speeds increase, as the volumes increase, so does the desire for more separation from moving cars. So at very low volumes and very low speeds, it's okay to mix traffic, and as those ranges go up, you start to want to separate different users out. And so we'll identify in the guide where those cutoff points are when it becomes more necessary to provide more separation. The context also focuses on different degrees of the built environment surrounding these facilities. When you've got more of a built-up area, such as maybe a small town core town center, versus outside of the built-up area, maybe it's more agricultural uses and perhaps a less improved roadway spaces. Every facility is paired with this type of application context. You can see here easy to read sort of graphic format providing your recommendations for speed and volume. This is maybe where a certain facility would be most appropriate, but also trying to be accepting and acknowledge the range of conditions that are out there and where maybe there's a potential range for applying this facility that goes above and beyond the preferred range. We talk about its role in the network. Does this facility belong on a local street, or maybe it's something that's more appropriate for collector or highway use? And then there's sort of that broad identification of, is this a facility that's appropriate in a built-up area versus a facility that's appropriate outside of a built-up area. Now, all of the facilities also come with case studies. I mentioned that every facility in the guide exists on the ground today. None of these are so new or so untested that they've never been used before. And so we wanted to tell that story of even some of these are still, though, relatively experimental and relatively new. And so we wanted to share the stories of the jurisdictions that have been implementing these facilities. We talk about kind of how it's used, what is that context for the facility, how did they design it, what elements did they use, and then how they funded it.
Thank you. And now we've come to our first question and answer section. For anyone that has any questions, if you would type those into the chat pod on the left-hand side. I am going to move us over to a poll break, but there will be a chat pod there still if anyone does have questions to put in. Our first poll question for the audience is, in what ways has FHWA encouraged design flexibility with regards to bicycle and pedestrian facilities over the last 7 years? By issuing design flexibility memorandum, by development of design guides, by expressing support for other best practices, or all of the above. So we'll give you a few seconds to put that in. And again, the chat pod has moved down to the bottom left-hand corner if anyone does have a question.
I see a question here
Yep,
asking
well,
oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. 1 second, we'll move over to that. I do want to address Hillary. If you are on the call, I'm going to let our speakers try and address that question in the chat pod, but if Hillary or any other FHWA people that are attending also have a response, if you'd like to type that in, we'll read it out in a second. Okay, so it does look like everyone has taken the poll, so I'm going to broadcast those results, Nick, so that you can see those, if you'd like to address the question.
Great, yeah, thank you. Most of you got this one right. The what ways has FHWA encouraged design flexibility with regards to bicycle and pedestrian facilities over the last 7 years? The answer is all of the above. They've been incredibly supportive at promoting innovation, advancement, and the use of good design for creating good places to walk and bike. So thank you all for that. Should we move to the question?
It does look like we did have that one question come in. The question is, any guesses as to whether the current administration will support a continued focus on expanding bike and pedestrian facilities?
Great, thank you. You know, obviously, I'm not representing FHWA or their opinion on the matter here, but I think the release of this guide and the attention that our small town and rural communities are receiving right now goes hand in hand. And what we want, really, I think the message of this guide is that when you are doing projects and infrastructure projects in your communities, think about the people that are walking and biking and use guides such as this to guide the development of those facilities as a part of your overall infrastructure investment.
Well said. Thank you very much, Nick.
Great, thank you. All right, so now with the context, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say I did have a response come in as well from someone from FHWA, and they said that at this point in time, they're not sure if anything will change, but for the time being, continue on as you have been.
Great, thank you. And now we're going to move into some of the sort of specific treatments, the facilities that are in the guide. So we're going to try to give you a good overview of what's in the guide so you'll know whether this is going to be a resource that you'll want to refer to for the projects that you're working on, or to maybe recommend that others that you work with refer to. I'm going to open this up and talk about the first set of facility types, and this focuses on that mixed traffic, the shared roadway conditions. In the guide, there are 3 facility types in this category. There's a treatment we call a yield roadway. There is the bicycle boulevard, and there's the new one, the advisory shoulder, which we're really excited to get to share with you. The yield roadway treatment is the first mixed traffic facility in the guide, and as you can see on the screen, it looks just like a very simple local road, because in a way that's exactly what it is. We really wanted to help tell the story to the people using this guide that you don't have to finish every street to like a full build-out scenario. That in some contexts and in some applications, a simple street with just a simple paved, narrow paved area can actually work great even for people walking and people biking. You don't always need a sidewalk. So we present a kind of paint a picture of this roadway type where you have a narrow two-way travel area that's paved. This is where people walk, this is where people bike, this is where people drive, and they do so politely, negotiating the space. Generally, it's in a residential context, and it's surrounded by sort of an unpaved roadside, no sidewalk or other separated facility is provided. The treatment itself applies to a kind of a limited range of uses. You can see here with the speed and volume chart on the left, this operates at very low volumes, under 2,000 cars per day, although we prefer it even under 500 cars per day. When you get down to very low volumes, it's all right to have pedestrians walking in the roadway. They're comfortable walking in the roadway. Same thing for speeds. We want to be operating at very low speeds. This is going to be pedestrian and bicycle compatible speeds, preferably less than 20 miles an hour. On the network, really we're focused on local links. This is not going to be the type of treatment you can put on a collector street or an arterial street. It is more local access focused street connections. And generally it's going to be in a built up area where you've got maybe residential uses and people will be walking to do errands or visit other people or just to get out of the house. The guidance itself provides some information on signage to indicate the sort of potential for pedestrians to be on the road. It provides guidance on yield operations. Narrow paved surfaces and yield roadways are pretty common in many residential neighborhoods where the space is constrained enough that 2 cars traveling in opposite directions actually have to yield to one another and negotiate that space. And we have an example here. Our case study in the guide is from Manzanita, Oregon, where their local street standards don't include sidewalks. It's just a simple 18-foot paved surface. It's got a 2-foot valley gutter to accommodate drainage, and then they allow parking on the street and creates a very compact, comfortable space for walking, biking, and driving. The second treatment in the mixed traffic chapter is what's called the bicycle boulevard. And some people may be familiar with this treatment as more of an urban-focused bicycle facility type, but it is something that we think works really well here in sort of small town and rural communities as well. Bicycle boulevards are bicycle priority streets where bicyclists and motor vehicles share the lane. Pedestrians tend to be accommodated on sidewalks. The volumes and the speeds, as you'll see, are operating at a higher range, and it's less comfortable for pedestrians to be walking in the road in those conditions. Bicycle boulevards are designed with potentially speed reduction measures, some sort of traffic calming to maintain a bicycle-compatible speed. You've got mixed traffic operation with bicyclists and motor vehicles sharing the lane, and then generally signing and marking to identify the route and make it very clear to everyone who's using it that this is a place where bicyclists are expected. So you can see the volume and the speed ranges increase slightly over the last treatment. In general, you want your volumes below 3,000 cars a day, and you want your speeds 25 miles an hour or below. In many small town communities, volumes really aren't the issue for bicycle boulevard implementation. You might have a small town whose entire population is 3,000 people, and so achieving less than 3,000 cars a day is not challenging. It's really about speed management to try to create bicycle-compatible speeds. As far as network links, bike boulevards tend to operate on local roadways, often as an alternative to an alignment along a busier street. So if you've got a connected network in your community or some degree of connectivity that lets you use an alignment along a local street to serve the transportation needs of your community, then you can maybe think a bike boulevard as a solution. And then the land use for bike boulevards is in built-up areas where you've got sort of origins and destinations and activity. You can see on this diagram of the bike boulevard sort of the heavy application of potential traffic calming devices. The guide does talk about traffic calming and the strategies that maybe are most appropriate in rural areas, areas that don't have a curb and gutter. But we illustrate both access management, speed management, and other traffic calming devices. This is an example of a bicycle boulevard in a small sort of tourist town in Ocean City, New Jersey. This route that is up on the screen is a parallel route to a busier main arterial street. So especially during kind of tourist season, that main route is very busy. It's not a very comfortable place for all ages and abilities users to ride their bikes. And so they have this parallel route where you can see the markings on the ground, 15-mile-an-hour speed limit, to try to create conditions where everyone is comfortable riding their bike. The last treatment in the mixed traffic chapter is sort of the newest, and we call it an advisory shoulder, although there are other names for this treatment. Some people may be familiar with this as being called an advisory bike lane, and I know that FHWA is doing experimentation right now for this facility type that they call dashed bike lanes. And this facility, it creates a type of a bike lane space on a road that is otherwise too narrow to support that. And it does so by, in a way, overlapping the shoulder or bike lane space with the travel area. So what you can see here on the image is you take what is normally maybe a 22-foot wide roadway, just 2 travel lanes worth of space, and you create a center 2-way travel lane. This is for motor vehicles operating in both directions will be driving in this center space. And on the edge of that roadway, you've defined this sort of bicycle preferential space with a permissive broken lane line. So that's where that dashed line comes in. The point here is to try to create conditions where bicyclists have priority in the position on that lane, and that motor vehicle operators, as they're driving on the street, will be passing these users with adequate space, and when confronted with a need to negotiate that space, will yield to the bicyclists when needed. We do have a pretty heavy disclaimer on the front of this treatment because it's still experimental. The advisory shoulders are a new treatment type in the United States. No performance data has yet been collected to compare to a substantial body of international experience. In order to install advisory shoulders, an approved request to experiment is required as detailed in Section 1A.10 of the MUTCD. And they are accepting requests for experimentation on a similar treatment right now called dashed bicycle lanes. So that's already being experimented with, and we continue to learn more about this facility type every day. Advisory shoulders can be designed to work on roads with even higher speeds and volumes than bicycle boulevards. We recommend them on streets at 3,000 cars a day or less, although there's some indication that they can operate sufficiently above that, up to 6,000 cars per day. And then they can operate as well on higher speeds, assuming you've got good sight lines and visibility. The type of interactions with oncoming vehicles requires that drivers be able to see oncoming vehicles soon enough in order to pull to the side and interact with them. As far as the network connection, this works best on collector streets and maybe some minor arterial streets. And then land uses, this is an appropriate facility type that works both in built-up areas as well as outside of built-up areas, as long as you meet those speed and volume requirements. The guidance for the advisory shoulder provides information on recommended roadway widths for different elements of the roadway. We do recommend that you allocate space to the advisory shoulder portion of the roadway first. If you can, provide a 6-foot wide advisory shoulder space on both sides, and then whatever space is left in the middle becomes that width for your two-way travel lane. And that may vary from, on the low end, maybe as low as 10 feet, just the width of a regular travel lane, but it can also go wider, up to 18 feet. Once you get past 18 feet, you can actually, you have enough space, you can create more of a conventional shoulder design. As that space gets wider, the types of interactions and potentially the volumes that that road can support also increase. This is as the sort of the experimental treatment. We have a few extra photos showing this facility type just to show how it works in the U.S. context. Here's an example from Hanover, New Hampshire. You can see here a narrow paved surface and those advisory shoulders painted on the lanes. In this case, there's no sidewalks, and so you'll see pedestrians are using the facility. Bloomington, Indiana, maybe beyond kind of the scope of a small town, has also experimented with this facility type. And you can see this, it's a connection on their bikeway network. They do have a sidewalk on one side of the street, and you'll notice on the other side where there is no sidewalk, people also are seen to be walking in the facility. And here's an installation from a suburban community, Edina, Minnesota, where they didn't have enough room to establish full formal bicycle lanes, and so they established these advisory bicycle lanes so that they could get enough space to try to improve the conditions for bicyclists. Here's another photograph of that example. You can see here sort of how those interactions work. This driver is currently driving in the advisory shoulder space, and it's unclear to me whether they're doing this as a response to the bicyclists, trying to give them more space, or if they're just driving in the lane unintentionally.
Thank you very much. And now we've come to another question and answer section again. I do see we have a couple questions coming in on the chat pod. We are going to move you over to another poll break, and then we will address those as well. The next poll question that we have for you is, under what roadway conditions are pedestrians comfortable sharing the same travel lane with motor vehicle traffic? Is it low speed, low volume, high speed, low volume, low speed, high volume, or high speed, high volume? We'll give you all a few seconds to fill that out, and then we'll address the questions in the chat pod afterwards. Like this was a very quick turnaround on the results. I had podcast those for you, Nick.
Great, thank you. We have 100%. You all got this one right. It is a pretty maybe a pretty obvious question, but I think it's really important in a rural environment where you may not have sidewalks or some sort of separate facilities, that you understand kind of when you can have pedestrians comfortably sharing that roadway. And so at low volumes, preferably under 500 cars a day, pedestrians have no problem walking in the road. But as those volumes increase, it becomes far more stressful, and the pressure to provide a separated facility increases.
So we did have a couple questions come in for you. The first one is, are the advisory shoulders limited to bikers, especially on low traffic roads?
This is a complicated question because of the desire to provide, not the desire even, just the regulatory requirement to provide accessible facilities for pedestrians. So if you are implementing an advisory shoulder with the purpose of being for pedestrian use, then you must make sure that it meets accessibility guidelines. And so that's just, that may be possible with the conditions on your road. It may be challenging depending on what you have in terms of cross slope, but it can be used by pedestrians. As you saw in those photographs, pedestrians will use it if it's there, and if there's no sidewalk provided, that's definitely where they will be walking.
Thank you. And the second one is also about the shoulders. How narrow can the travel lane be made? Is there regulatory guidance that prevents it from getting too small, given that the broken lines are permissive?
The guide itself has a sort of a low-end range of 10 feet, sort of the width, a narrow travel lane width. It's still an area where we're learning, and so as a part of the experimentation process, I imagine you would be making some decisions to experiment with that variable. There are some examples of the same facility type in Europe where that center lane gets narrower than that, down to about 8.5 feet even, very narrow space. So I hesitate to give too firm of an answer because we're still learning here in the United States about what works best for our context.
Okay, thank you so much. It does look like we have another question coming in, but we are going to move forward with the presentation, and we'll go back to that question at the next question section. Our next presenter is Tim Gustafson. So Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Everyone can hear me clearly. That's correct?
Correct.
All right. Well, and thanks to Nick for getting us started on today. When Nick and I were preparing how we wanted to split up the context, we decided this was a good place for me to pick up where he left off. And so I'll be covering the module next that helps you understand the range of visually and physically separated facilities in this guide. And to that end, there are 3 segments in this section with a slight disclaimer on the third one. Again, we saved the newer and more interesting item for the end of this module to give you a sense of what this is for. And I think this may also help answer some of the questions related to an advisory shoulder and how the facility mentioned here is a little bit different than that for certain users. So in this module, we'll cover the paved shoulder, the good old-fashioned bike lane and how it may be interpreted for better use in rural and small-town environments, and then a relatively different treatment that is called the pedestrian lane, which, while it does not necessarily appear in Chapter 5 of the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide, we put it here because it still is visual separation, but we'll explain kind of some of the uncertainty surrounding that and how you might want to approach using it. So the first one that we want to get into is the paved shoulder. The paved shoulder is nothing necessarily new, but the reason we wanted to expand on it here in the guide is to help explain the benefits that it can provide in these rural environments. And as you can see here by the diagram that shows what it consists of, is the paved shoulder provides you a little bit of additional width on the edge of a roadway, usually with an open drainage system, no curb and gutter. It has very visually apparent striping on the edge of it, so you understand where the edge of the roadway is. And sometimes this shoulder can contain a contrasting pavement material so as to differentiate it from the traveled way. And then the last element that you see on this page, which I will get into in just a little bit, is the location of the rumble strips. And I've given presentations on this topic before, and I know that there are some questions surrounding the use of rumble strips and what their application is intended for. So I will talk a little bit about how some communities are hesitant to use them for noise purposes, but how you can address that if that is something that you're considering with your paved shoulder. As Nick mentioned about the different types of guidance, this shows kind of the areas where the paved shoulder is best suited. We find that these are preferred on the higher speed and higher volume roadways because of many of the reasons Nick mentioned, some of those slower speed and lower volume roadways have other treatments that are better suited for accommodating bicyclists. And so the paved shoulder here is shown to help you address those connections when you are in a different location, higher speed, higher volume environments. From the network standpoint, these are intended for your collectors and your arterial roadways. And in the small town context, these can sometimes provide very helpful connections between smaller communities. As you know, that when you leave one small town headed for another, there is a bit of a stretch between those two communities, and sometimes the paved shoulder provides you a good opportunity to connect those. However, we do say that you can use them inside of developed areas as well as outside them regarding the land use context. Now, I mentioned the rumble strip part of the treatment, and this is because paved shoulders on the edge of a road can serve as a functional space for bicyclists and pedestrians in the absence of other facilities. And that is, I think, the important distinction between a general use shoulder and a paved shoulder, or putting another facility within the right-of-way intended for other users, is if there is no other facility within the right-of-way, say, for example, a side path or a sidewalk, this is a facility that will be used by both bicyclists and pedestrians unless otherwise posted or restricted. And so in so doing, you want to make sure that you have the right amount of separation from moving traffic adjacent to it. And so as you can see kind of in the near right side of this diagram, there is a recommendation for the placement of rumble strips. And this is for two reasons. The main reason of a rumble strip in a rural context is to keep vehicles in their traveled lane. And so the noise that you're all familiar hearing should only happen when a vehicle is departing a lane where it shouldn't. And so this is the crash avoidance technique, a best practice for doing so. And in the areas outside of built-up environments, this is important to keep vehicles aligned in their traveled way. If you're adding bicyclists to that paved shoulder in this capacity, you want to provide openings, and there's guidance in this guide as well as the AASHTO bike guide for how frequently and how long of a space you need for bicyclists in case they need to take an evasive action around an obstacle or a pothole or standing water, what have you. That's the reason we provide brakes in it. But the placement of the rumble strips themselves are a crash mitigation tool. So I find that it's important to help distinguish the difference between the use of rumble strips just as they are for roadway design in general, and what changes you make to them if that shoulder is intended to accommodate bicyclists. So that's just one point that I think is helpful when communicating to people considering these treatments. Here in Townsend, Montana, you can see that there is a buffer separating the traveled way from the shoulder, and you can see a pair of rumble strips in this environment because they are very earnest about making sure that the lane alignment is appropriate. In this example, in Kepe, California, you can see even some very small towns can do some innovative treatments with their shoulder. And as you can see here, that contrasting pavement helps to further communicate the difference between the traveled way and the shoulder that can be used by bicyclists and pedestrians. And here they've gone so far as to do a stamped asphalt treatment that takes the place of any type of rumble strip because this is a lower speed environment, but also makes it clear that this shoulder is intended for other roadway users. Here in D'Iberville, Mississippi, you can see it's just a single rumble strip, and then outside of that is room for bicycling. This is a higher speed roadway, and you can see that it's got no curb and gutter, open drainage, and so the width of this shoulder is wider than the minimum, and as you can see, if that's the case, sometimes you have room for two bicyclists, although in general, these are intended for single file riding. In Montpelier, this is actually a shoulder that I've had the privilege of bicycling on myself when conducting trainings out for the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And this was a roadway environment, and you can see it's a little bit different because in the foreground, traveling towards you is a shared lane marking for bicyclists, and at this shoulder is a common location where you see bicycle and pedestrian activity. This additional pavement marking was added for bicyclists to make clear that if you do have to pass a pedestrian and you are supposed to yield to a pedestrian if you're in the shoulder, you can use the traveled lane in this environment. So a few different treatments for how that paved shoulder can be applied in rural and small town environments, but the basic metrics of what you need to provide and where are the reason that it's included in this guide. So the next feature that we want to move on to is the bike lane. And I would say that as far as bicycle facilities go, bike lanes are probably the facility type that people are most familiar with because they've probably been most visible in communities up until this point. And so the bike lane, while not necessarily all that different from other applications, we've included here because we want to make a few distinctions for how it can be used in a small town environment and how it differentiates from some of the other treatments that we've covered thus far. So as you can see here, a bike lane consists of the pavement marking and striping for the bike lane itself. You have intersection crossing markings when it crosses another roadway, or if guidance suggests that you have a driveway with high enough volumes that you need an intersection crossing marking. Otherwise, a bike lane is continuous across some of those private drives and things of that nature. And the other element that's important to point out in this is that there is another facility in the picture for pedestrian movement. And that's the main distinction, I think, that separates a bike lane from some of the other treatments that Nick and I have covered so far. Regarding placement, in the traffic placement, you can see that this is intended for higher speed and higher volume environments. It does have potential in some of those lower environments, but I would say that there is a need for greater physical separation on the upper end of the spectrum, as Nick mentioned. So if you have a desire to place a bike lane on some of those higher speed, higher volume roadways, that additional separation, that additional buffer may be necessary in order to provide it. And that's because these are intended for your collectors and your arterials, as we mentioned. And from a land use context, these can be provided in built-up areas as well as outside of them. So as I mentioned, a bike lane is designating exclusive space for the use of bicyclists through the use of pavement markings and regulatory signage, which is optional. But the minimum requirement is the pavement marking and the designation that it's exclusive use. A bike lane is located directly adjacent to the motor vehicle travel lane and is the same direction as the motorized travel lane. So it's important to make it clear that a bike lane travels in the same direction as automobile traffic, and that there are other treatments that help you to differentiate if you want bidirectional or contraflow travel. Here's a good example on a roadway that used to be higher speed and high volume that is now Old Route 66 in Wildwood, Missouri. Here you see they've just striped the edge line and they have a shoulder adjacent to it. This is a recent resurfacing project with some shoulder widening. The one caveat I would place in this photograph is that that shoulder seems a little bit steep. You might want to bring that up to grade for the bicyclist in case somebody departs from the lane. They have a little bit of room to correct for that movement. But otherwise, this is the typical type of treatment that you could provide in these conditions, and not much more is needed. In a slightly closer to town treatment, you can see that in Lyndonville, Vermont, here is a treatment where a bike lane has been added to the roadway and that the additional space was given to the buffer. This is an important consideration, and I like to stress this. Whenever you have additional width that is not needed to meet the requirements of the traveled lane or the bike lane, your best bet is to fill that space with the buffer. This is helpful because it helps to ensure that appropriate alignment for all roadway users, that they're in the center of the lane where they're most comfortable and most visible to other users, and so that if you do have things like heavy vehicles, farm equipment, vehicles with large mirror overhangs, that overhang takes place in the buffer zone, not in anybody's traveled way. So here's another treatment, and like I said, we put this one near the back because we wanted to help introduce some of the other topics and then talk about how this one is a little bit different. And so the pedestrian lane is another one of those experimental facilities, and that's because there is still some research being done to help understand where it fits in the context of all of this other guidance. So the pedestrian lane is different from a bike lane because it is definitely intended for pedestrian use. As you can see here in the image, we've placed the bicyclist in the roadway in a shared travel lane condition, and that the pedestrian lane is marked by a double solid white line, making it clear that this is not a facility that you can cross over into if you're motorized traffic. There are pedestrian lane markings to identify it. Crosswalks are marked very highly visible. And you can see that it is clearly intended for the use of a single mode. And as I mentioned, here's our disclaimer on this one. As part of the planning process, you do want to take time to think about some of the issues related to making this a pedestrian facility, particularly because you need to make sure that it is accessible in its crossings, which also means the detectable warning tiles, how you make sure that it is clearly for use by pedestrians only and that you don't have bicyclists in it. And then you do want to make sure that you take care of things like your cross slope requirements, how you're going to plow and sweep it from debris and to clear snow. So you can see that there are some things that are in the desired treatment. I'll go back just a bit. You can see that sometimes you see a flexible delineator helping to identify where the limits of that are. We'll get into a little bit more on flexible delineators if questions arise. But in general, you want to make sure that you have a facility that can be kept clear. I apologize for the misnomer here on the header, but as far as traffic, these are still intended for low-speed, low-volume environments, fewer than 2,000 vehicles per day, 20 miles per hour of speed. These can provide links in a variety of network contexts. You can do this on local roadways or your collectors, but generally not intended for arterials or higher speed, higher volume, because again, you're going to want that greater separation from moving traffic. These are definitely recommended for in built-up areas where you anticipate that there will be enough pedestrian traffic to make this facility necessary, and so that is one thing that you want to consider. As I mentioned, this is treated as an interim or temporary pedestrian facility, and the guidance is not yet very clear on what interim and what temporary means. There's no determination on length or time duration for how long something like this should be installed, but it's intended to address a specific need where there is a high level of pedestrian traffic or an anticipation thereof, and there's a need to accommodate them. So sometimes you want to supplement this with some signage. We've shown the on-roadway warning sign here in this image, and there's some minimum width requirements and pavement marking requirements to make it very clear that this is intended for pedestrian traffic. Here's an example from Detroit, Oregon. This is a very low speed, low volume roadway in a relatively small town with a lot of recreational and seasonal traffic. So as you can see here, we have a pedestrian lane on the single side of the roadway with pavement markings and signage to further clarify that this is intended for pedestrian traffic, for people walking their dogs, for jogging, and that all other traffic, including bicycle traffic, goes into the shared roadway environment. Now we're going to move on to some physical separation facilities. We've got 4 in this topic that I'll cover. There's the shared use path, the side path, and how that differs from a shared use path, the use of sidewalks, and when you need separated bike lanes. So the first up is the side path. A side path is different from a shoulder in that it is a facility that is not connected to the exact traveled way pavement, but it's slightly different because it is a shared use facility within the right-of-way. And you see here in the image, you've got an unpaved separation from the traveled way. You have high visibility crosswalks, and you can see that the side path deviates away from traveled way when it approaches a crossing. This is to provide a right angle crossing wherever possible, to minimize the exposure and the width of the crossing to bicyclists and pedestrians. And in some cases, you'll see that it's deviated enough so that there is an entire car length of storage between moving traffic and the traffic control device. In this situation, you have much wider application in speed and volume context. That's because the separation is quite great. You can see that side paths are typically installed along arterials and collectors, and that they can be used inside of and outside of built-up areas. Now, I did stress earlier that this is a two-way facility, that it's located immediately adjacent to a roadway, And it provides a higher quality facility because of that separation. And so the guide has some diagrams to help clarify what kind of separation and how much you need for each of these types of separations. So you can see that you can do that with an open drainage swale, a grass buffer that needs to be at least 5 feet in width. If you are doing less than 5 feet, you do need some sort of a physical barrier, and you must take care to make sure that that barrier is still outside of the clear zone for the traveled way. I received questions about this, that you do still need to make sure this shows kind of a barrier that's still outside of that clear zone for the traveled way. Or you can do what is done similar to how the shoulders were treated, where you can do a separation with the use of rumble strips. When side paths are crossing facilities, you do want to take care to make clear how that separation is done and where those crossings happen. So there's guidance in there for treatment on how to cross facilities, what you might need to do for bicycle and pedestrian traffic. Here's an example from South Lake Tahoe where there is landscaping in that separation between the traveled way and the shared use path. As you can see, this provides a very high quality and comfortable facility that makes clear that this is not a road. And you can see the difference between the traveled way and the shared use path environment. As I mentioned, the shared use path needs to have attention paid where it crosses. We've moved on to the next facility. The shared use path is a new facility, and this one is entirely outside of the right-of-way, and that's what makes it different than the side path. And so you can see what we've done here is this one is important to note how it interacts with roadways when it's crossing the roadway, because it's entirely separated from roadways until there's a crossing. So you make it a very big, you pay a lot of attention to where it's crossing, how you assign right-of-way, how you enhance that crossing so as to minimize the exposure to bicyclists and pedestrians, and know that you need to take a little bit more attention at the crossings so that the shared use path can be as comfortable and as desirable as it is during the full length. Slightly modified guidance here because since this is not within a roadway context, it's all about considering how it interacts when it crosses that facility. So as you can see here, it's relatively comfortable in low to moderate speeds and volumes, but there might be some concern if you're going to very high speed environments. Some extra care may need to be taken when you're making those crossings. The image here showing the network shows that it can cross these roadway networks at a variety of locations, and so you may need to do a little bit of intersection treatments in each of these cases, particularly because the shared use path spends most of its time outside of built-up areas. Here's the guidance that you can see in the guide. It's intended to be used by all roadway users, and there is more attention paid in the guide here to how you are crossing your roadways. There's a lot of treatments that have come about in recent years that help to really elevate the visibility at crossings and to change the amount of detection and right-of-way warning and traffic control that happens at these locations. So the guide gets into more about the crossings for shared use paths, because this is where we felt, and the FHWA felt, good guidance at the crossings can help elevate these from their design that people are familiar with to what additional guidance has come out recently. Here you can see a high-intensity activated crosswalk marking at a crossing in Bentonville, Arkansas. It's an otherwise very comfortable facility, but they wanted to take a little bit extra time here to show how much attention needs to be paid at the crossings to warn approaching motorists that the trail is here, and that this one automatically detects the presence of bicyclists and pedestrians so that they know when traffic has been stopped in opposing directions and that you can proceed. The last treatment that I want to talk, or second to last treatment that I want to talk about is the sidewalk. Again, the sidewalk is not necessarily new or innovative, but the application that it has in this guide was interesting to help make sure that it's not perceived as something that's too urban. I think that's really what the attention paid here is. This sidewalk shows that it is separated from the traveled way by an unpaved section. And again, as I mentioned, in other situations where you have vulnerable users crossing the roadway, attention should be paid where sidewalks meet crossing treatments. So high visibility crosswalks are important. Sidewalks have application in a wide variety of traffic and network contexts. These definitely are things that you want to pay attention to in your built-up environments because, again, you have the presence of pedestrian traffic such that a facility of this type is needed. And as I mentioned, I think in some contexts, sidewalks may be perceived as too urban, but the reason they're included here is because they provide dedicated space intended for use by pedestrians that's safe, comfortable, and I think the greatest key is the accessibility part. They're physically separated from the roadway, and a sidewalk can be installed even in environments where there is no curb and gutter. You see here the image shows the open drainage through the furnishing and through zone, and that the traveled way for the pedestrians is completely exclusive from automobiles. And I think this is helpful too because it helps organize the space for where you can see parkway trees, mailboxes, and things of that nature in an environment that's not necessarily perceived as urban. And these may be necessary because you have small town environments that come to a downtown or a town center, and there is a need to have some sidewalk treatment. So here's an example from Denmark, South Carolina. Another feature you might enjoy seeing here is that there is some rain garden treatment on an open drainage environment alongside the roadway. This shows that you can have your sidewalk and your drainage and your landscaping in some otherwise perceived as constrained environments. And I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a very urban context. And the last item as we're going through the physical separation is the treatment known as the separated bike lane. Now the separated bike lane, as you can see here, is different from the traveled way. It is different from the sidewalk. It is its own facility that is separated from both of these roadway or features in the roadway. And we wanted to spend a little time explaining what makes this different than some of the other treatments you've seen here. So as you can see here, there is a separation from bicycles and pedestrians, as well as a separation from bicyclists and automobile traffic. You can do this through the use of the open grass areas as shown there. This is done also to provide that sight distance between the various users so that users can see each other. There needs to be enough separation. It bends back toward the roadway so as to bend away from the high visibility crosswalk at this intersection. And the various pavement markings that you can see, the dash markings across the intersection, and how it interacts with the roadway as well as the sidewalk. Separated bike lanes have utility, again, in a wide variety of traffic and speed environments. The higher volume, higher speed environments are suitable, but again, we stress the importance of with greater speed comes a need for greater separation. So that is something that you want to think about when implementing separated bike lanes or even planning for them. They're best suited on your collector roadways where there is a need to separate the users of each mode and each type based on their speed differential. And that these have application in your more built-up environments, and something like a separated bike lane may transition to a side path or a paved shoulder once you get back out. So that's the other thing that I think that this guide helps to consider is how to change that facility as you change the land use context. This is intended for exclusive use by bicyclists, so you'll typically see it on roadways where there is traveled way and also a facility for pedestrians. And that's why it's important to consider that. It is adjacent to the roadway, and there is usually some vertical element that helps delineate the difference between the separated bike lane and the traveled lane. So here you can see a couple of different ways that you can treat it. You can do so with the open landscape area. You can show it with or without curb and gutter as long as you're taking drainage into consideration. You can see it alongside of a pedestrian facility or show a pedestrian facility elsewhere. And then you could even show some sort of a curb-type barrier that separates the various traveled lane and separated bike lane. Here's a facility type that you can see in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where until this facility was installed, the bike lane was actually part of the shoulder you see there, and the seam between the asphalt and gutter pan were basically right where the bicyclist wheel would be located. So when they had a chance to retrofit this facility, they were able to place a separated bike lane up on top of the curb and still provide the necessary separation from the sidewalk that you see here on the right. Here's another facility on a way to treat this is Russellville, Arkansas, where you can see that you've got a curb and gutter type arrangement and a desire to include landscaping, and it's appropriate to put the separated bike lane off behind that and still provides that separation from the sidewalk, which you see farther to the right. And now we're going to move on to the pod and chat.
Yes, thank you very much. We have had quite a few questions come in, so and I know we have one more section left in the presentation. So we're going to skip the poll question right now and go straight into questions. This first one, the first part of the question came in during the last section, and it says, I noticed in the pictures people walking with traffic in the bike lane. Have there been experiments where the bike lane is in one direction but a pedestrian marking telling people to walk looking towards traffic and bicyclists? So in the third section you did address that, but so the second piece that came in about that same question was that, you know, the Section 3 answered my question, but shouldn't the pedestrian markings be in the other direction?
That question came up from the Detroit, Oregon. Is that correct?
I believe, I honestly don't know. Peter, if you could let us know if you know that answer.
All right, I will answer the...
There was a picture with pedestrians going in one direction and bicyclists going in the other.
Okay. I do see in the chat pod that there was a question about the Detroit, Oregon example. Do pedestrians move in both directions on a single path? To answer that one, the answer is yes. It's a very low speed, low volume, and the pavement markings were provided consistent with the signage, but in that example you do see pedestrians traveling both ways on that side of the road.
And I'll go back through the presentation and see if I can figure out the other location for you. But the next question is, how do you deal with stop drivers on side street not looking for or expecting bikes approaching from the right on two-way paths versus a typical approach only from the left on a one-way path?
Typically when you're installing, that's a good question, when you're installing a side path, there is guidance for how to provide warning signage at the stop control for that cross street. And oftentimes, especially if the side path is somewhat new and novel, there will be additional guide signage that you can install that instructs motorists to look both ways for shared use path traffic. This can be done in advance of the crossing. It's usually warning signage that does so. And then the stop bar and the landscaping and the clear zone that you establish helps to pull that line of sight such that a motorist can see traffic coming in both directions along that side path. And then in some cases, as I mentioned, by bending the side path away from the roadway, it creates an environment where the motorist can approach the stop control, stop and look for a gap in the shared use path traffic, and then proceed with caution towards the rest of the intersection where they can then look for a gap in motorized traffic. So part of that bending away from the traveled way helps to recognize that that movement usually takes place in two stages. And if you have an environment where you have lower speeds and lower volumes on your shared use path and on the roadway in question, usually can navigate that without too much difficulty. If you find that you have much higher speeds and higher volumes approaching that shared use path intersection and that roadway intersection, there may be a need to go to a signalized control environment.
Thank you. And it looks like Peter is trying to let us know that on slide 65 was where it was. So Lyndonville, Vermont, perhaps?
Yes, okay. So the Lyndonville, Vermont section does show a sidewalk in the background and a buffered bike lane traveling in each direction in the foreground. In that example, the sidewalk terminated at the street in the background, and a high visibility crosswalk was provided so that pedestrians can continue across the street and in either direction to continue their travel. But the buffered bike lane shown in the Lyndonville, Vermont photograph is purely for bicyclist movement in the direction that the pavement marking indicates.
Perfect. Thank you very much for answering that. And Peter, thank you for figuring out which slide for us as well. We have another question that came in. It says the MUTCD has very specific speed and volume limits for striping pedestrian crossings across uncontrolled crossings that should be followed carefully. I guess that was more of a statement.
Yes, and that's actually a very good point. One of the things that I want to stress about pavement markings in uncontrolled environments is that speed and context is also a very good indicator for how much needs to be done to make that crossing comfortable for the purposes of a crossing. And so there is guidance out there, and I want to stress the disclaimer that pavement markings alone cannot elevate a crossing in a high-speed, high-volume environment to the level of comfort that is needed. So it's important to consider the other pavement markings, the other traffic control devices, and the other geometric treatments that may be needed to elevate that crossing to the point where it is a comfortable facility and the appropriate amount of advanced notification and traffic control is provided for automobile traffic. So that's a very good point. This guide talks a lot about the geometric design of treatments. There is a lot of guidance in there about traffic control devices, and in each case, the guide does definitely refer you back to the MUTCD on how much is needed and when.
Thank you. We do have one final question, and then we can finish up. But your last question is, oftentimes shared paths may be near railroad tracks. Do you have any guidance on how to handle crossings for all modes?
Yes, and I would say that when there is a shared use path that travels parallel to a railroad track, the guidance for making sure that there is a crossing usually what happens is the shared use path meets the roadway in question at the railroad crossing. And in general, it is difficult to get a new crossing of a railroad facility. So in situations where a shared use path or a side path is crossing the railroad, it may be important to bring that crossing up to the roadway, provide the additional separation that the other facilities here are showing you what happens, and treat them as a single crossing across a railroad crossing. There's additional guidance in the MUTCD for how railroad crossings should be treated. And again, this defers to that guidance in order to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to when designing those facilities. So if you do have specific questions about railroad crossing guidance, look to the facility that you can see here in this guide, see the references that come from the AASHTO Bike Guide and the MUTCD, and refer to those to make sure that your pavement markings and your signage are consistent with what needs to be there.
Thank you. It looks like you've answered all of the questions that are in the chat pod so far, so I'll turn it back over to you for the fourth section.
Okay. And I know that we are coming up on time, so here's the last module that we want to cover. Is we want to provide you with a little bit of what else is in the guide for completing those networks. There's a few things in here that might be helpful for you. So one of the items that is in the later section of the guide is how to focus on closing specific gaps and how you can identify some unique opportunities, because small town and rural environments have some of these that may be a challenge. And so some of these are speed management, how you address connections near schools, what you can do with a main street in a small town environment to make it more supportive of multimodal transportation, bridges, which are a unique topic and a particular interest of mine on what you can do, because they're there for quite a long time and there's only so much you can do in the near and short term. And then some guidance for how to access public lands, which I think small town and rural environments may have a preponderance of with regards to recreation, open space, and conservation. So one of the things that Nick mentioned early on, and I think I've touched on a few times, is there may be a need to manage speeds in some of these environments. More often than not, volume is not necessarily the culprit or the problem we're trying to solve, but that speed is usually the concern that people have with roadway users of different modes sharing a similar space. So if you're interested in reaching that objective of shared environment, there's some guidance in there for how to manage speed through the use of roundabouts, shown in here on the image on the left, some horizontal deflection in the version of deflectors or neck downs in the two images on the right. And this helps to emphasize that crashes are much more severe and more likely to be fatal at higher speeds. And if you have vulnerable roadway users such as bicyclists, pedestrians, people walking to school, there is an incentive and definitely an interest in helping to reduce those speeds. And I think that rural environments have just as much of an interest, if not more, in doing so in key locations. As I mentioned, school connections might be an area where you want to apply a little bit more design treatments than you would otherwise outside of that environment. And I think this helps to touch on, you don't necessarily feel that a sidewalk may be needed during an entire length of a facility, but there may be an interest, especially if you know of the school travel area, to provide sidewalks or other facilities in the vicinity of that school because you know that the volumes are higher, the need to mitigate conflicts is higher, and the need to separate those conflicts is higher. So it's important to think about school connections as these destinations where a little bit more attention is warranted. Another thing that the guide provides is some guidance on how you can retrofit or conceive new multimodal main streets for small towns and rural environments. And I think that this is interesting because there's guidance that you can follow and look at some ideas on how to treat roadways that are 2 lanes, 3 lanes, 4 lanes, and in some cases even 5 lanes wide. When you have a multi-lane highway that comes into a downtown environment, the speeds come way down, but the cross-section remains about the same. And so the guide gives a little bit of guidance on how to go about rearranging the users in that space and guidance for how you can do so on these different streets. As I mentioned, bridges are a particular point of concern in rural environments and small towns because while you may have an otherwise comfortable facility along a roadway, you may have adequate right-of-way to provide the space for the users that you wish to accommodate. Sometimes when you get to a bridge, that becomes a very constrained environment, and the challenges go up because this is an area where if facilities cannot be provided, this area continues to be a gap in the network. And so the guide provides a little bit of information on how to separate different users as you approach and use the bridge. Whose movement do you prioritize when making crossings of that? How do you make different users aware of the presence of others, making sure that that facility and that network can continue to be connected? And then if you don't have the ability to get everything that you want the first time around, think about how you may over time implement more treatments. Say, for example, after resurfacing the bridge, there's only so much you can do, but if the bridge deck is being replaced, for example, or the whole structure and superstructure are being replaced, how much more incrementally you can get out of that facility each time it is improved. And the important thing is to remain flexible in how much you might be able to get out of that facility each time. So there's some guidance for what you might do if your bridge is constrained in the near to middle term. If you just are trying to accommodate automobiles, that image on the upper left is pretty much the existing condition. But if you wish to accommodate other users, there's a couple of diagrams that show how you might do shared lane markings, how you might implement that advisory shoulder in a couple of different environments, or if you want to go to a more traditional treatment, which we see oftentimes in rural environments, you may need to go to a 1-lane bridge condition if the speeds and volumes provide that it's feasible. And near lastly, I would say that access to public lands is something that is worth considering in these environments. This is important because in rural and small town environments, there may be a need to accommodate active transportation users who are interested in hiking or walking out to a natural resource environment. And by providing that connectivity, that provides that ability for tourism. And I think that it's important to think that when you're doing things of that nature, it may also open up the opportunity to go after different types of funding, such as the Federal Lands Transportation Program and the Federal Lands Access Program, which have utility in these types of situations when you're trying to provide connections in areas that are not under your typical types of roadway jurisdiction. And so you see here is an image from the Colorado River Riverway Path near Moab, when there's a need to provide a separate facility from the roadway that you see there on the left. And so to close up, we wanted to touch on a couple of places where you can find the guide, because the good news is that the guide is absolutely free. The Federal Highway Administration has the PDF available for download on its publications page, and For those of you who are interested in downloading the presentation, we put the link in here as well so that you don't have to worry about taking it down in your notes. There is an interactive online guide available at ruraldesignguide.com. This is really helpful because if you're interested in scrolling through the pictures and you want to see all of the case studies, it's a very easy interactive experience that doesn't necessarily require you to dig down into the PDF and go through all of the pages. As you can see here, it's also been made suitable for mobile viewing. So if you're just interested in showing it to an elected official, or you're at a stakeholder meeting, or you really just want to share it with your colleague in a comfortable environment, ruraldesignguide.com is a good opportunity to do so as well. And then, of course, if you have questions, you can always contact us at Alta Planning and Design.
Thank you very much. We've come to the last question and answer section, so if there are any final questions, you can type those into the chat pod. I will come back and look and see if there are any. I am going to move on just because there is only a few minutes left, but please feel free to put in questions and answers, and we will address those in a few slides. So today, what we hope you achieved with this webinar was that you'll be able to describe the national level history of design flexibility and understand how this new resource relates to existing standards, understand the range of mixed traffic and shared roadway facilities included in the guide, understand the range of visually and physically separated facilities in the guide, and identify other opportunities for completing links in rural multimodal networks and learn where to access the guide. So I do want to remind all of you that in the bottom left-hand corner is today's PowerPoint presentation in case you were interested in any of the links that were provided, any of the pictures. This is being recorded, will be available on the Safety Center website within the next few days. We do have a few other upcoming webinars. In March, we have a Safety Performance Management webinar, which will go over the regulations that have been put forward for state DOTs, but it will focus on how local agencies can help their state DOT comply with those regulations. So it'll focus more on the local side of it. We also in April have a webinar on unpaved roads as well. As always, you can find all of our previous webinars on our website. We do have another one that we've been asked to announce. This is put on by the Center for Health and Safety Culture at Montana State University. They are having a traffic safety citizenship webinar this Thursday at noon Mountain Time. And so you can find all the information here on this slide. If you do need more information about it, you can email us at info@ruralsafetycenter.com or .org, sorry, and I will provide that information to you. But again, if you download this, all of the links are in this on this PowerPoint presentation as well. We do have training videos, if you're interested in those, available on our website. And again, as Tim and Nick both mentioned, you can feel free to contact both of them with any further questions on this particular webinar. It does look like we have not had any more questions come in, so I do want to take one last minute to thank Tim and Nick very much from the Safety Center for presenting today. It was a fabulous webinar, and I think this guide is going to be greatly useful for our entire audience at the Safety Center. So thank you again for doing that for us, and we can't wait to put the archived webinar up on our website. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.